Nobody gave you permission to question the history books. Consider this your permission. One day they were here. The next 50,000 people were simply gone. No bodies, no graves, no farewell inscriptions on the walls, just empty streets, cold hearths, and a silence that has lasted over 3,000 years. We're talking about the Bronze Age collapse, specifically the city of Ugarit, one of the most sophisticated urban centers the ancient world had ever produced. In 1200 BC, Ugarit had running water systems, international trade routes connecting Egypt to Greece, and a writing system so advanced it influenced every alphabet you've ever used, including the one you're reading right now. Then, sometime between 1185 and 1180 BC, it simply ceased to exist. Archaeologists found a half-finished letter in the city's ruins, a desperate plea for military help that was never sent. The clay tablet was still sitting in the kiln when the city died. That detail should unsettle you, because what erased Ugarit may not have been a single catastrophe. It may have been something far more familiar.
You might think this is a story about dead kings and forgotten empires. It isn't. This is a story about what happens when interconnected systems fail all at once, and why that pattern keeps repeating. In 1200 BC, the Mediterranean world was not a collection of isolated tribes. It was a globalized network. Egypt was trading grain with the Hittites. The Mycenaean Greeks were exporting wine and olive oil to Canaan. Ugarit sat at the center of all of it, a cosmopolitan trading hub with merchants from at least 7 different civilizations living inside its walls simultaneously. Sound familiar? The Bronze Age world was, by the standards of its time, as interconnected as ours. Ships crossed the Mediterranean on predictable schedules. Diplomatic letters flew between royal courts. There were supply chains for copper and tin, the 2 metals you needed to make bronze, the material that powered every weapon, every tool, every war. When that network broke, it didn't break slowly. It broke catastrophically within a single generation, across an entire region. Every major palace civilization in the eastern Mediterranean, gone. Mycenae, Tiryns, Hattusa, Ugarit, all collapsed within roughly 50 years of each other. 50,000 people in Ugarit alone vanished. Here is the first warning, and it's one historians resisted for decades because it felt too simple. The climate changed. Not slowly, the way textbooks describe geological shifts, rapidly, violently. A 2022 study published in PLOS One analyzed pollen records from a lake in Cyprus, just 60 miles from Ugarit, and found evidence of a severe, prolonged drought beginning around 1200 BC. Crop yields collapsed, famine spread, and here is where it gets dangerous. The Bronze Age world had no redundancy in its food systems. Every palace civilization was running on grain surpluses stored in centralized warehouses. When the harvests failed 2, 3, 4 years in a row, those warehouses emptied. There was no backup, no alternative infrastructure. The Hittite king wrote a letter to Egypt around 1200 BC begging for emergency grain shipments. He described his people dying in the streets. The Egyptian pharaoh, Merneptah, did send grain. We have the records. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. When a civilization builds its entire survival on a single fragile resource chain, one bad harvest season doesn't just cause hunger. It causes collapse. The drought didn't destroy the Bronze Age alone, but it pulled the first thread. The second warning is darker, because it shows you how quickly desperation becomes destruction. When the famines hit inland regions, people moved toward the coasts, thousands of them, then tens of thousands. Ancient Egyptian records describe massive waves of migrants moving through the Levant and into the Mediterranean world, people the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. Historians have debated for 150 years exactly who the Sea Peoples were. The most current scholarship, including work by archaeologist Eric Klein, suggests they weren't one group at all. They were multiple displaced populations, Mycenaeans, Anatolians, possibly early Philistines, all fleeing the same cascading failures. Starving, desperate, moving in organized groups with weapons and families. They didn't just raid coastal cities. They absorbed them. They destabilized them. They transformed the entire cultural map of the Mediterranean. Here is what's chilling. The cities that fell weren't weak. Ugarit had defensive walls. It had a professional military. It had warning. That unsent clay tablet we mentioned at the start? It was a response to an earlier letter from the king of Alashia, modern Cyprus, who wrote to Ugarit's king warning him ships had been spotted. An enemy was coming by sea. Ugarit's king wrote back saying his own army was away at war, his fleet was in a distant harbor, and he had nothing left to defend the city with. He was writing that letter when Ugarit burned. The third warning is the most important one, and the reason historians kept missing it for so long is that they were looking for a single cause. They wanted a smoking gun, one invader, one earthquake, one plague. But 1200 BC doesn't work that way. Seismologists have found evidence of massive earthquakes along the eastern Mediterranean fault lines right around this period. Epidemiologists have found indirect evidence of disease outbreaks. Internal rebellions are documented in Egyptian and Hittite records. Tin supply routes from Afghanistan were disrupted, meaning bronze production slowed, meaning militaries lost their technological edge. Every single one of these factors alone would have been survivable. Ugarit had survived earthquakes before. The Hittites had fought off invasions before. Egypt had weathered famines before. What they could not survive was all of it happening simultaneously within a system with zero slack, zero redundancy, and zero capacity to absorb multiple shocks at once. This is what historians now call a systems collapse. Not one catastrophe, a cascade, each failure amplifying the next. The drought creates famine. Famine creates migration. Migration creates conflict. Conflict disrupts trade. Disrupted trade collapses economies. Collapsed economies prevent disaster response. And somewhere in that chain, 50,000 people in Ugarit run out of options. The letter never gets sent. The city burns. And the Bronze Age, 3 centuries of the most sophisticated civilization the world had yet produced, ends in a single generation. Here's what makes the Bronze Age collapse so intellectually dangerous. Every generation since its discovery has projected its own fears onto it. In the 1800s, when European empires were anxious about barbarian invasions, scholars blamed the Sea Peoples entirely. Savage outsiders destroying civilization. In the Cold War era, when nuclear annihilation felt imminent, scholars focused on sudden catastrophic destruction events. Now, in 2024, when we're living through climate anxiety, supply chain fragility, and mass migration headlines, suddenly the multi-causal systems collapse theory feels most convincing. None of these interpretations are wrong. They're all partially right. But the reason each generation latches onto one cause is because it's psychologically easier. Single causes are manageable. They have solutions. If it was just the Sea Peoples, you build a bigger navy. If it was just the drought, you build better grain storage. Systems collapse. So what do you do with this information? What's the takeaway that makes this more than just a fascinating history lesson? The Bronze Age collapse offers 3 hard lessons that every civilization, including ours, ignores at its peril. First, redundancy is survival. Ugarit had no backup systems. When their army was gone and their fleet was elsewhere, they had nothing. The civilizations that survived 1200 BC, Egypt, Assyria, though diminished, survived because they had geographic buffers, diversified food sources, and enough internal resilience to absorb individual shocks. Second, early warnings are not optional. That letter from the king of Alashia warning Ugarit about ships spotted offshore, that was the early warning system. Ugarit's king acknowledged the threat, admitted he had no resources to respond, and then apparently did nothing. The warning came. It was received. It was ignored because acting on it felt impossible given all the other simultaneous crises. Third, complexity without flexibility is a trap. The Bronze Age world built an extraordinarily sophisticated network of trade, diplomacy, and specialized production, but in optimizing for efficiency, it eliminated slack. There was no room for error, no tolerance for disruption. The very sophistication that made these civilizations great made them brittle. Now close that curiosity loop we opened at the start. We asked what erased 50,000 people from Ugarit. You now know it wasn't one thing. It was everything all at once in a system that had forgotten how to fail gracefully. The clay tablet in the kiln, the letter never sent, the city that burned while its king was writing for help that couldn't arrive in time. That is not just ancient history. That is a warning written in ash and silence, 3,200 years old, still waiting to be read. If this video changed how you think about civilizational fragility, share it with one person who needs to hear it. History isn't just about the past. It's the only data set we have for understanding how the present ends. Subscribe if you want more investigations like this one. We go deep so you don't have to wonder. Drop your theory in the comments. What do you think was the real killing blow for Ugarit? The drought, the sea peoples, the system's failure, or something else entirely? The debate is still open. Historians are still arguing. And honestly, that's exactly how it should be. Because the moment we think we have a definitive answer, we've stopped asking the dangerous questions. The link to 1177 BC on Audible is in the description. Read it. You'll never look at interconnected systems the same way again. Disclaimer. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing constitutes professional advice of any kind.